Hello and welcome to FinTech Diary. In this chapter of FinTech Diary on ETBFSI.com, I have with me Thomas Krogh Jensen, the CEO of Copenhagen FinTech region, and we'll try to learn from him what is the current state of the fintechs in Denmark or specifically Nordic region, and how do they look at India's fintech hub. So Thomas, glad to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me and super happy to be here.
Sure, thank you so much, Thomas. So let me begin by asking you a very simple question. What is the current state of fintechs in Denmark or specifically your region? What are the business models they are looking at? What kind of solutions they are offering? How many unicorns fintechs are there? And how actually the fintechs are emerging in your region, Thomas?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Great question and a simple question, but maybe a little bit more difficult to ask in a short manner, or to answer in a short manner. So I would say, of course, the Nordics, like the rest of the world, are affected by the current economic downturn and recession, right? So of course we can the fintech startups, and of course we as a cluster organization organizing a lot of what's going on in the Nordics. In the Nordics, of course, we can feel the impact of that. Investors are being more hesitant. You certainly have to press a lot more doorbells in order to have open doors and raise your rounds, right? So a lot more bridges, a lot more internal rounds are being raised right now, also in the Nordics. Although we see that the good companies with a steady growth and a good team, they still manage to raise, especially in the early stages, right? So if we look at the Nordics overall, I would say the fintech ecosystem are in pretty good shape. I think we still get a lot of interest from outside of the Nordics in what's going on. And I think if you look at the size of the region, which is a fairly small region, 27 million people, small countries. But what we see is that the region, because it's so highly digitized, I think if you look at the index, the different indexes of highly digitized countries, the Nordic countries are always in top 5. If you look at some of the most innovative countries around the world, you actually have Sweden, you have Denmark, Finland, and so on and so forth. If you look at the digital infrastructure, especially in financial services, that infrastructure is often developed in a public-private partnerships. We have a foundation that really nurtures fintech and has created a number of fintech successes that is larger than our region kind of indicates it should be. So if you look at Klarna, of course, iSettle. If you look at Chainalysis, Pleo, Lunar, some of these big companies that are now unicorns, Tradeshift, Banking Circle grew out of the Nordics. So we actually have quite a number of unicorns, and I think that's a testimony to the innovation and the level of innovation that is going on in the Nordics. So of course there are struggles with the current economic climate. It's there's still a lot of activity. And I think we still see a lot of companies coming out, especially in the early stages. So we're still, I think the Nordics are still going strong.
Okay, sure. So just to understand the size, Thomas, is there any data in terms of how many total number of fintechs there and how many of them are are carrying the label of unicorn?
Of course, it's always. I think you know that also. The data on investments are a little bit. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to get. I think if we look at the number of fintech companies, and of course that's not an exact number, but our number says there is around 1,500 companies if you take Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. So 1,500 fintech companies. Out of these, around 1,500, around 350 are in Denmark. Sweden being the largest ecosystem with just shy of, I think, 450, 500 companies, something like that. So that gives you an indication. When it comes to unicorn, if you come to Nordic founded companies, I would say we're probably between 12, 15, which is some kind of measure of, again, coming back to the size of the region and fairly small countries, right? So 1,500 companies, 12, 15 unicorns, just from the hip here, what I know of. And then if you look at, and then I have the Danish numbers most present, but if you look at money being raised in 2021 in the Danish ecosystem, it was 9 billion Danish kroner. Last year, 2022, that number fell like in most regions around the world. So that was around 3.2 billion Danish kroners. So certainly a little bit less activities, but actually the number of deals being made were actually slightly higher than in 2020. So which is what we compare with now. So 2021 was certainly an extraordinary good year. 2022 was maybe more what we would see would be a normal year. And in terms of investments, that is around between 3 and 4 billion Danish kroners.
Okay.
And if you look at some of the, you asked me also a little bit about what are the solutions coming out of the Nordics, right?
Exactly. The segments they're operating in.
Yeah. And of course, we see the same segments or the same verticals as you do in your region. But I think if we look at, again, coming back a little bit to the strength position of the Nordics, there's a huge focus on sustainable fintech. So definitely when it comes to, for instance, ESG screening, when it comes to climate, environment, fintechs working within the framework of the 17 UN Global Sustainable Development Goals. That is certainly an area where we see a lot of fintechs operating. We see, especially in the SME space, 99% of, and I think, I don't know the exact number, but that probably is the same, around the same for India, right? But 99% of businesses in the Nordic region that are SMEs. They struggled during COVID. They are certainly having a bit of a rough time right now in the current economic climate. So I think we see a lot of solutions in the fintech space targeting especially the fintechs, because the incumbent sector, the incumbent industry has been neglecting them for quite some years. So they are very open to trying out new innovative solutions. And then that leads us a little bit into another space where we can see there's a lot of stuff happening, and that is the embedded finance space. So I think we see a lot of, and again, coming back to the SME, we see a lot of fintech solutions starting to embed themselves in other platforms, other solutions where they can get access to scale. They went from wanting scale through the banks, and now they're going to other industries looking for that scale. And that could be cloud accounting platforms. It could be telcos. There's a lot of examples of other industries now having a much bigger interest in what's going on in the fintech space than before. And then I think the last one segment that we also see is, because the Nordic countries are fairly wealthy countries, people in general have quite some savings. They tend to invest quite a lot. So I think in the whole space of wealth management, asset management, capital markets, investing, I think there we see also quite a lot of activity. So in general, sustainability, climate, impact, ESG, we see it in the SME space, going on to embedded finance, and then wealth management, asset management. I think those are the sub verticals where we really see the most activity.
Okay, noted your points. Now, one important question, Thomas, is, and that's the question that is most of the fintechs have started thinking of right now, that is majorly asked, is about the profitability. Because in the last 5 years, the rally of fintech was far more towards just solution and innovation, and nobody spoke specifically about the profitability. But when now the funding winter is kind of real, when the founders and the investors who has been pouring money into this fintechs and startups since last 5-6 years are looking for a value, right? So the straight question to you, Thomas, is: are these fintechs operating in your region profitable? Or how many of them are profitable? Are they at least thinking in that direction?
Of course, and I do. although we don't have the specific number on profitability, and every case is a little bit different. But in general, I think what we see in the Nordics, we have been lagging a little bit behind on the valuations, and that means also we don't get the crazy highs, but we also don't get the crazy lows. So it's a little bit more mellow here. But of course we're seeing the same. I think there was to some extent, and just if it was a hunt for numbers, and if you just had enough users, eventually the thesis was you would figure out how you would earn money, right?
Right.
And that is certainly a thing of the past. I think as investors begin to demand that they have in the early stages, of course, the same thing applies. You have a good team, solid idea that can scale. The technology is there, but you also want, even in the early stages, you also want to see that there's a clear path towards, okay, so you can acquire users, good for you, but how are you going to earn money? How are you going to earn money short term, but also long term? And how is this scalable, and so on and so forth? So I think there's a lot more focus on the fundamentals also here in the Nordics. And then you asked me how many are profitable.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the startup and in the early stages, this is not what we see the most. This is not necessarily what the investors want also. They want a clear path towards profitability, but they certainly also want to see a scalable model, and a scalable model demands some capital in the early stages also, right? But then at some point you want to see that revenue. You want to see, how are you going to earn money from those users you are onboarding. So I would say I think we see pretty much the same as in many other regions.
Sure. But when we try to decode the business model, how's it there, Thomas? Is the cost of customer acquisition is really high, or it's absolutely easy? Just, customers are absolutely fine to download any app that they want. And is there any translation that the fintechs can see out of this customer acquisition heading towards profitability?
Yeah, so super good question. And I think, so that might bring us also to discuss the differences between the Nordic ecosystem and your own the Indian fintech ecosystem, right? I think what we in general see in the Nordics, and mind you, this is a more general overview. I think we see way more B2B solutions, fintechs that are going towards businesses or banks in partnerships, than we see B2C. And consumer models, and I think that is certainly due to, if you look at in general, and especially if you look at the Danish ecosystem, the rounds being raised in general are on average a bit smaller, and that talks into, at some point, especially if you operate in the B2C space, that becomes a little bit of sales and marketing game, right? It's a matter of customer acquisition cost and how you can scale that, and that demands a lot of money. So when you have a smaller countries, smaller ecosystem, I think you will see there's a tendency to go B2B, and that, of course, that where the models for scaling are a little bit more varied. If what I've seen, at least from the Indian market, is some really interesting solutions targeting consumers and going directly to consumers. Some really big rounds in order to make that scale and acquire clients, right? And acquire customers. And I think we don't see the same in the Nordics. If you just look at challenger banks as an example here in Denmark, I think that we have two that is a good example. We have Luna Bank, which have chosen to go deep, but go deep in the Nordics. And then we have Compass Bank, which has chosen to focus on the business banking side, and I think that is also very much in a realization that there's a limitation to the market size, and there's also I think the Nordic banking market are interesting because the margins are quite high. So it's an interesting market to attack for challenger banks. But then again, you're coming back to the market size, right? And that's where I think the big differences between the Nordics and the and Denmark and India is.
Right. Sure. So glad that you spoke partly about India, which was in fact my next question or immediate question. So how do you see Indian market right now? Because there is a great positivity about Indian fintechs. We have large number of fintechs. If you calculate, it would be more than 5,000. More than 20 are actually in the unicorn clubs, and there are 3-4 already listed in the country. Again, profitability is a different aspect that we partly discussed, but we'll discuss here as well. But how do you see, the whole scenario of Indian fintechs right now?
What we have seen and constantly see when we either we go to India or we go to Southeast Asia, we've been quite active in Singapore, and obviously there we meet a lot of Indian startups, right? And I think what we see is extremely high quality. We see companies, of course, having the benefit and the backwind of a huge market, and I think that's to a large extent is also a great advantage, right? So these companies comes with a market that is big, with a talent pool that is amazing, which obviously also in the Nordics here is a struggle, and talent is a struggle for us here. So I think in general we see really high quality. We see Indian companies in general looking a bit more, which I think is completely natural, towards of course focusing on their home market and then scaling in those markets near to them because they're so much more bigger. A little bit less towards going into Europe and the Nordics, again coming back to some probably the size of the markets and the difference in that. I think we see, especially when it comes to some of the consumer solutions, I think there's some really interesting stuff going on here. I think technology-wise, I think we see interesting stuff in the whole fraud, anti-money laundering area. At least that's some of the solutions I've been presented with. Also, and I think those Indian companies that have looked towards the Nordics are also some of the solutions in the investment space, asset management, wealth management, investment space, which is interesting for us to be exposed to. So we are super impressed with what we see, the innovation that is coming out of India, and I think to some extent what we're also seeing is in the Nordics, and for good or bad, as I said, we are highly digitized and with a digitized infrastructure, and sometimes that's both a blessing and a curse, right? Because the solutions being developed here can work here, but maybe not so many other places. And I think what we see India skipping maybe 2 or 3 steps, and especially in for instance, I think that's a good example, blockchain technologies. We see some pretty interesting solutions in that space also coming out of India, where we maybe see a little bit less activity in that, which also has some of one of the reasons is also the uptake in the incumbent industry and with the national banks and so on and so forth. I know India, you're also talking about a digitized currency, right? And I think in terms of that, we're a little bit more hesitant in the Nordics in general. So really impressed with what we see.
Sure, but in terms of the business or the partnerships, or maybe making work together, right? Do you see some opportunities, for Danish fintechs to work in India or Indian fintechs to work there? If yes, what could be those opportunities, partnerships, or the solutions that they can bring together?
And I think if we start with the Indian fintechs going to the Nordics, we already had in our lab, we have a space where there's constantly 30, 40 companies sitting from around the world, many of them from the Nordics, but we actually had quite a number of Indian companies also, and we've had Danish investors investing in Indian companies. We've had Indian investment platforms coming to the Nordics. as mentioned. So I think we can definitely see an interest, and we can see a relevance from Indian companies looking towards the Nordics. The other way going around, we've also had over the years quite a few delegations. We've been attending quite a few conferences, both in person and virtually over the past years, and we also see a huge interest from Danish fintech companies in the Indian market. Obviously, one of the main reasons due to size, and then also, of course, because of the super talented people. So there's definitely a huge potential.
Right.
I think in general, we need to see more companies investing long term, and that's probably one of the things we would like to see even more in the coming years. That is Danish Nordic companies setting up subsidiaries in India and trying to work the market a bit more long term, because it is a market you need to be acquainted with. You need to grow your network. You need to develop your partnerships. I think that's the way, and that takes time. And sometimes for startups, it's not time is a limited resource, right? But that's where we would like to see some more startups invest in setting up subsidiaries and partnerships, and then work the market long term. Because if it is a huge market, it's super interesting, and we would like to see more Nordic companies doing that in India.
Okay. So looks like you have a strong pipeline for 23-24 specifically for India, right?
Definitely, we hope to, and we just talked about that. We hope to be out there for some of the conferences and bringing companies, and hopefully be able to matchmake these companies with Indian stakeholders.
But what would be the major challenge when you actually bring such companies? Because ultimately it's a geopolitical issues, like different regulations, different offerings. So what will actually make a difference, and how should both the region streamline if they want to work together? Any thoughts on that?
What we have tried to do when Indian companies come to Denmark, that is, we acknowledge that there is certainly difference in the markets, right? And I think what's really important for startups in general are that they get access to quick validation. Is this relevant in a Nordic context or not? One thing is that we can see that it works and there's relevance in our home market, but is it valid? Is it relevant in a very different market? And I think that access to quick validation, access to stakeholders where you can sit down, talk to them, figure out the interest, figure out how does that technology, how does that solution work in a Danish or a Nordic context, that is quite crucial. And I think the same goes the other way. I think Nordic companies that have a thesis that this would fit the Indian market, what they would really benefit from is local engagement, local stakeholders engaging with them, helping them get that early validation of, is there a business case? Is there an interest? Can we potentially develop partnerships? I think that is super crucial in order for them to figure out quite fast, is this the right market for me? And then hopefully set up a shop, hopefully then develop the necessary partnerships, and then start scaling into the Indian market. So I think really local stakeholders engaging is super important. And then, of course, access to local investments that can help them in the local market is also quite important, right?
Sure. I guess quite meaningful thoughts here, Thomas. Maybe I think I will shoot one more, and that's perhaps the last question, unless you want to add something. So we all see the great optimism specifically for fintechs, and they're coming with greater solutions, which has made our lives easy in some extent, for sure. But going ahead, ultimately they will have to come with business model which is sustainable and profitable as well. Currently, most of the fintechs all over the world are relying specifically on the partnerships and the collaborations model which they have with the banks and the financial institutions. So going ahead, how do you see the whole collaboration and the partnership model will pan out? Point number one. And going two, do you think that the consolidation is also on the way because a lot of fintechs are offering kind of a similar solutions. And considering now the investors are going slow because the fintech funding winter is quite real. Do you think the consolidation is also on its way?
I think we're going, we are heading towards a super interesting period where, as you say, consolidation, you will see a lot of mergers and acquisitions. You will probably see the banks buying up. You will see telcos. You will see some of the other tech companies that will be snapping up fintech solutions. You will definitely also, and I think we can see that also here in the Nordic region, that you will see that fintechs increasingly are not only looking toward the incumbent banks, pension or insurance industry for scale and partnerships. They will be looking for scale in many other industries, whether it's airlines, telcos, accounting platforms, wherever they can form the partnerships or embed their services that gives them access to that scale. I think one of the areas where we also see, fintech moving from something that was mainly a financial thing, something that was happening in the financial ecosystem and using technology, that ecosystem, to something where we see a lot of different industries beginning to figure out how can we actually start embedding fintech solutions in our current products, where it's automobiles, or if it's pumps, or if it's like whatever it is, like how can we fit in payment solutions? How can we work with alternative financing? How can we so on and so forth? So I think we will see fintech moving from being a vertical to being something infrastructure, something horizontal, that every industry eventually will start looking at and enriching and embedding into their current products. And again, that also comes down to providing that necessary scale for these technology solutions, right? So definitely consolidation, definitely there will be mergers, acquisitions, definitely we will see a lot of alternative partnerships across different industries. So I think we are heading towards a pretty exciting future for fintech, and I'm very much looking forward to it the next couple of years.
Sure. I think a very interesting statement, Thomas, that fintechs will move from vertical to horizontal. Quite interesting. I think meaningful thoughts here, Thomas. I think I'm sure the readers and the viewers will enjoy what you said, specifically about Danish and the Indian fintechs and the opportunities and the changes and the challenges happening in this space. I must thank you for sharing your perspective here on FinTech Diary and taking out time early in the morning there in Copenhagen and sharing.
Just got my morning coffee here.
Oh, sure, Thomas. So great, good to have you here, and thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting.
For all the perspective that we shared.
Thank you so much for inviting. It was a huge pleasure to join you again.
Sure. And thank you so much for watching FinTech Diary, ladies and gentlemen.